Hey guys, welcome to the Perfectly Wasted Podcast. I'm the host, DullOxide. Today is episode 20 on RNG. You can find all my previous episodes on the Drinking Wisemen YouTube channel, as well as my day-to-day photos on my Instagram at DullOxide. First off, what is RNG? Okay, so RNG stands for Random Number Generator, and usually you're not going to run into this unless you play video games or play any game of chance, really, and that's kind of where RNG comes in. So in the earliest stages of random number generators, most of them were utilized for things like gambling, games of chance, things like this. So technically speaking, you could say that flipping a coin is a type of RNG and rolling a die is a type of RNG. And in video games, whenever you get a drop, there is an RNG mechanism that determines what your drop is. So basically, I'm going to kind of go over the different types that are there, some that we see and some that we don't realize are RNG, and just kind of give you some examples of how RNG actually works. Now, one such example of RNG is in the game Overwatch. So you have these loot boxes that are here that essentially are like a random either skin, voice line, spray, things like that. And by opening the loot box, which you'll have to forgive me here, I'm going to have to turn to do it, you have a random chance of these items. And you can get the same thing that you've gotten before, or you can get new things. Now, this is based on an RNG type table. For video games, RNG is quite a bit different than, if you will, like dice, okay? So dice don't actually have the same type of RNG as a video game does, and the reason being is that dice are different in a lot of different ways. So the random number generator that's on video games is basing the randomness that you're getting off of usually the clock that is on the computer. So let's just say, for example, in the simplest of ways, if you go on, you open a loot box at exactly noon, then the best chance that you get the same items from the loot box would be, again, opening it at noon. Now, there are other factors that come into play, like, for instance, a game could take into account more than one random factor. So if it takes the time into account down to the millisecond and then goes and takes maybe your login time into account or some other dynamic number, so an unchanging number into account, then that can increase the randomness by 1,000-fold or more, depending on how much that number is. So basically, there's a lot of different ways to increase randomness that we see, and some of the ways that they do that is, like I mentioned, either login times being down to the millisecond along with the real-time clock on your computer, along with maybe the mob that you killed if you're playing a game like Warcraft or Diablo. These are all things that affect something like your loot table. And then at that point, once you're determined that you're inside of a special loot table, then it gives you randomly loot from that table, and that's kind of at another random chance. So this is an example of RNG. Now, there are other examples of RNG that are more commonplace that you might run into. Like, for instance, we have play dice. So play dice are RNG in like a more basic form. You have a 1 in 6 chance of rolling what you want. If you're using regular play dice like these that have been tumble rolled, then actually there's a higher chance of you rolling some numbers than others, because the tumble rolling process basically sands down the sides of the die and make it so that there's a higher chance that if you roll with a certain force, that you can flip onto a certain side of the die as long as you roll it a certain way. And that's something that gets taken into account by people. And if you go to somewhere like a casino, then they have these types of dice. And you're saying, well, they're 6-sided dice, they're the same. You'll notice that the edges on these are much sharper. They're referred to, I believe, as razor edges, which means that they haven't been tumble rolled, which means that the randomness factor has basically been as randomized as they can make it. The reason that they do this is because they want it to hit on a side and stay flat. That's why it's very sharp edges, so that it can't continue to roll unless it has a certain amount of force. Now, some people will say, well, if you roll the die the same way 100 times, then the chances that you get the same roll is higher. Okay, yeah, so that's the truth too, and that's why they make things called dice towers. So if you have a dice tower, like I made one here, it took about 2 hours, and you take a die and you drop it down the middle, you can hear it bounces and rattles around inside, and you essentially get the same power of every roll, which increases your randomness factor. So everyone's always trying to increase your randomness factor so that you don't get the best things. Obviously, inside of Overwatch, they have their method where they go through and you can get duplicates. So that's something that's really shitty. But also, the skin pool is different at any given time. In Diablo, for example, different seasons have different item drops. The different types of monsters you have a higher rate of dropping. Legendaries, if it's a harder monster, they might take into account the experience a monster gives, or the monster number, or any number of other things that contribute to RNG. So when you're thinking and people talk about RNG, what they really mean is the randomness in which you're able to achieve what you're looking for. So if an example, I was looking for the new Mercy skin in Overwatch, the chance that I get that is going to be the same on every single loot box that I have, except if I open all of the loot boxes at the same exact time on any given day, then that factor may be increased. All right. Since I don't actually know what the RNG factor, the algorithm that they're using inside of Overwatch is, it's impossible to tell how much that percentage is that I might be able to increase it. But theoretically speaking, if you're opening the boxes on the same millisecond every single day, then you have the same chance of randomness to be able to get it, which is basically like saying that you're using like one deck of cards, and inside of that 52 cards, you have a 1 in 52 chance of drawing the card that you want. So that's one way that you could try to increase your randomness factor inside of video games, is by doing things at a certain time. I know that people used to say that Diablo, for instance, if you had a rift that you had opened, that the chances of duplicate items dropping inside of the same rift were higher. And the only reason that I could think that that would actually be true would be because you're basing it off of the time that the rift opened. So if you base it off of the time that the rift opened, and then the monster that was killed, and additionally a millisecond factor for when the monster is killed, then you have these three factors, and as long as they line up properly, you have a chance of getting the item right. I've seen it on a few occasions where it has happened, where I've gotten the same item inside of a rift, and in some cases, duplicate items on the same drop. And I believe that that's because the monsters died at the same time, and it just happened to be the same monster number or whatever that gave me the same loot table, and I happened to be lucky enough to get the same loot. So there's a lot of factors that you have to take into account when you're thinking of random numbers, and one of the easiest ways to think of it is that the numbers actually aren't random at all. It's based on an equation that's happening in the background, and that equation can be manipulated. Now, the level at which it can be manipulated is kind of absurd. It's kind of like saying if you were opening like a loot box on Overwatch, getting the same skin twice inside of the same loot box, the probability is really, really low. And it might even be programmed in to not be possible at all. But that being said, there is a chance that you could do something, inside of, for instance, blind packs for trading card games. They have a certain randomness that they have to go through. So you always see that there's at least one rare card, and then from there, anything rare or above is usually not in there. The chances that you get 2 rare cards is extremely rare, but they usually put that on the pack. So that's because they have a machine that's sorting it, and they're getting the randomness factor on it. So that's actually a higher chance than the randomness factor in a game, which is based off of, usually, like I said, the real-time clock's millisecond factor, which could be a 1 in 1,000 numbers for any second, for instance. And the randomness factor just continuously fluctuates, which makes it so that basing it on it seems like it's extremely random. With that, there are other random number generators, like I stated, the coin, and like a D6 or a D20, for example, or a D12 even. This die can only roll a 1 in 12, so you can't roll a 13, it's impossible. However, because this die has been tumble rolled, some numbers may occur more frequently. And with that being said, there is a chance that I could roll, a 12 out of 12 times. So basically, all I'm trying to do is explain here how RNG is not really random. It is practically random, and that is to say that a lot of programs and things like this use random number generators, and they are random enough to be able to be passable for the means that they're doing. There is no truly random way that I know about that you can get just a completely random number. It always has to be based off of some variable, and because it's based off of that, if you have that variable, you can simulate the same results continuously, and that's kind of what companies try and avoid. But for video game purposes, RNG works pretty good. Anyone that's played most video games can tell you the algorithm is usually pretty randomized. You're not getting the same items all the time. You're not getting the same skins all the time. But that's essentially what RNG is and what it's based on, to give you an idea. So now that we've talked about something completely boring, and if you've even made it to this part of the episode, thank you again for watching. I appreciate it. Please do like, subscribe, and share. And again, that was 10 minutes perfectly wasted.